Narratives and cinematic presentation in Games Day. 1. What is narrative in games? This week, I want to talk about narratives in games and whether cinematic presentations necessarily make them better. It's a fascinating topic because everyone loves a good story. But when it comes to games, things get more complicated than with linear media like novels or films. Let's start with a quick definition, because when players, or even developers, talk about narrative, they often mean slightly different things. That causes a lot of confusion and sometimes pretty heated debates. Now, Wikipedia tries to define narrative in a broad, inclusive way, but even that doesn't quite pin it down. For example, imagine a chess player who views the advancing pawns as heroic soldiers. That's a story too, right? But it's not really embedded in the game, it's imagined on top. So, to keep things clear for the discussion this week, here's the definition I'll use. Game narratives are sequences of events, facilitated by elements directly embedded in the game, where the designers aim to evoke emotional resonance drawn from the player's previous narrative experiences. This is heavily inspired by Henry Jenkins' ideas in game design as narrative architecture, with a small tweak of my own. With that groundwork in place, let's begin exploring how narrative and cinematic presentation intersect in actual games. Day 2. Return of the Obra Dinn. Let's start with an unusual case. Return of the Obra Dinn. It's a game that tells a compelling story, but it does so without traditional cinematic presentation. You play as an insurance investigator, reconstructing the fates of a ship's crew using only brief, frozen vignettes of their deaths. There's no camera movement, no cutscenes, no orchestrated sequences. Yet the narrative is incredibly engaging, because the joy doesn't come from watching the story unfold. It comes from piecing it together yourself. The game leans into its medium as an interactive space. The satisfaction comes not from being shown the story, but from deducing it. And if we imagine replacing those still vignettes with actual animated cutscenes, would the story be better? Maybe not, because doing so would take away the tension of exploring the scene yourself and diminish that feeling of agency. Here, less spectacle creates more atmosphere. It lets the player project emotion and fill in the gaps with their own imagination, a strength unique to interactive media. Day 3. God of War, 2018. On the opposite end of the spectrum, let's talk about a game that embraces cinematic storytelling in all its glory. God of War, 2018. Here, the camera never cuts. It follows Kratos and Atreus through a journey as emotional as it is epic. The game presents a story of redemption and fatherhood, rendered with high-fidelity visuals, orchestral swells, and expertly directed cutscenes. It feels like you're watching a film, but you're also playing it. The cinematic approach enhances the narrative and gameplay at once. Emotional beats land hard because of the visual storytelling. Boss fights feel massive, not just because of mechanics, but because of how they're framed and paced. It's a case where the story is strong, the presentation is intentional, and every cinematic element supports the gameplay and narrative in tandem. Day 4. Witcher 3 versus Disco Elysium. Let's do something different now. Let's compare two games with strong storytelling, but very different approaches. The Witcher 3 and Disco Elysium. Both are open-worldish RPGs with player-driven narratives. Witcher 3 leans into cinematics, rich dialogue scenes, voice acting, emotional cutscenes. Moments like Ciri's flashbacks hit hard because they're presented with polish and clarity. The world feels alive, and cinematic moments enhance player immersion. But Disco Elysium takes the opposite route. It's text-heavy, has no voice acting in many parts, and no cutscenes to speak of. Yet it tells an incredibly nuanced and moving story. It invites players to project their own tone onto the protagonist through choices, internal monologues, and symbolic storytelling. Here, the lack of cinematics doesn't hurt. It actually helps create a deeply personal narrative space, shaped by the player's imagination. Two games, two styles, both valid, both powerful. Day 5. Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Third. Now let's flip the script. Here's a case where the cinematics are top tier, but the story itself, not so much. Modern Warfare 3 features incredible visual fidelity, high-budget cutscenes, photorealistic environments, dramatic set pieces. It looks like a Hollywood movie. But the actual narrative is weak. The villain is a tired trope. The heroes are familiar faces without meaningful arcs. The sequence of events lacks emotional weight. It shows that cinematic polish alone can't carry a story. At best, it masks the narrative weakness just enough for surface-level enjoyment. But ultimately, if we strip away the visuals, what's left? Not much. So we're reminded. Presentation can amplify a story, but it can't substitute for substance. Day 6. To the Moon. Now let's explore a very different kind of game. To the Moon. This game has a strong linear plot, deeply emotional beats, and a structure that almost begs for cinematic treatment. Yet it has no cutscenes. Why? Because it was made in RPG Maker. And because of budget constraints, full motion video or even elaborate in-engine cinematics just weren't possible. But the developers leaned into what they had: powerful writing, a beautiful soundtrack, and simple visuals. And they crafted one of the most emotionally resonant stories in gaming. Moments like the mother's death or the final reveal could easily be imagined with sweeping camera shots and orchestral cues. But they still hit hard, even without them. It proves that even when we lack the tools for cinematic storytelling, we can still evoke cinematic emotions, and that's a powerful lesson for indie devs. Constraints don't limit creativity, they focus it. Conclusion. So over the course of this week, we've seen games with and without cinematics. Some that thrive on visual storytelling, others that succeed by leaving space for imagination. The question isn't, should your game have cutscenes? The question is, what kind of experience are you trying to create? If cinematics serve that experience, great. If not, there are other, equally powerful ways to tell stories in games. And sometimes, the lack of spectacle makes the emotion hit even harder.